chapter 12, talking about the Beinoni, and specifically talking about the experience that the Beinoni has. Remember, a Beinoni is an unusual person, in our lives at least an unusual person, because a Beinoni is somebody who, what we know so far, is our aspiration. We haven't yet got a clear handle on what a Beinoni is, but we do know that that's the spiritual state that we're supposed to aspire towards. What we've learned immediately before this is what a Beinoni experiences while davening. And just learning that, before you unpack it, just learning the consciousness of a Beinoni during davening, during prayer, is enough to make us all feel inadequate. Because we know how hackneyed our prayers could be and how distracted we often are. I often think about it that we have these devices. Everybody's running around with a device, which is in their pocket or in close proximity. And the amount of distraction that device can create is enormous. And that's even without looking at it. So, needless to say, when a person's looking at their device, it's distracting. And unfortunately, people do that during the middle of the prayer service. But even when you're not looking at it, there's always this wonder, hang on, maybe there's a message that I should be looking at. Maybe I missed something. It's really distracting for us. The Beinoni, by contrast, is somebody who is completely focused, laser focused on their experience. Not only are they focused in the sense that they can concentrate, because with a little practice we could do that too, but they have a very profound contemplative experience of that focus. It's not just thinking what do the words mean or what is the message behind this particular section of the prayers. Their focus is very profound. They're contemplating what each particular segment means, and they're visualizing, not just thinking about, but they're visualizing what it is and their relationship with Hashem. And so the prayer experience for them is transformational, actually. And it's for that reason that we ended off last time by saying that while the Beinoni is in a state of prayer, the Beinoni has an experience which is akin to the experience of a tzaddik. It's not the same as a tzaddik, for very obvious reasons, very important reasons, which I'll talk about in a second, but it's akin to a tzaddik. It feels to the Beinoni that this is what it must be like to be a tzaddik. The reason that the Beinoni's experience is fundamentally different to the tzaddik is because for the Beinoni it is temporary, and for the tzaddik this is permanent. And the reason that it's temporary for the Beinoni and permanent for the tzaddik is because their experience of dealing with their negative side, with their toxic traits, is completely and fundamentally different. We've already learned that what constitutes a tzaddik is somebody who no longer has that negativity in their system for one of two reasons. Either they're an imperfect tzaddik, which means that they have completely overwhelmed all of the negativity within their conscious mind, within their feelings. It's so overwhelmed that it's the equivalent of having a very powerful police force, and therefore there are no criminals on the streets. So the Beinoni has no possibility, the tzaddik, the imperfect tzaddik, has no possibility of being tempted or being distracted or being sabotaged by the Yetzer Hara. Or even beyond that, if they're a perfect tzaddik, then not only have they quelled their negative side, but they have transformed it and converted it from being something which is unhealthy to being something which is not only healthy, but actually very positive. The Beinoni does not have that. So this is really important for us. The Beinoni does not have that sense of being rid of the temptation, rid of the distraction. The Beinoni has the negative within their system, and it would be the equivalent of that negative being asleep. So now we've got a different metaphor to use. In the case of the tzaddik, whether it be the imperfect or the perfect tzaddik, all the bad guys are out of the picture. They're either locked up, imperfect tzaddik, or they are rehabilitated and they're now assisting the process in the case of the perfect tzaddik. The Beinoni's experience is the bad guys are asleep. So you can visualize it almost like the cartoon character tiptoeing past the sleeping sentry, trying not to wake him because we don't want that problem in our lives. While the Beinoni is deeply immersed in the meditations of prayer, they have put their Yetzer Hara to sleep. And that might be a little consolation, by the way, to rabbis who put the congregation to sleep. So it's a similar kind of thing. You're in a state of spirituality. So those people maybe who are not feeling so connected to the spirituality end up falling asleep. Obviously, that's not what we want as rabbis. We want them to be listening. The Beinoni is quite happy for the Yetzer Hara to be sleeping. That's it. You're not bothering me right now. You're not hacking a chinik like the rest of us have. We're davening, and all the time we've got this woodpecker Yetzer Hara that's going, maybe you should hurry this up a little bit because you need to eat breakfast, or you need to get to a work meeting, or you want to beat the traffic, or whatever other excuses it is that our Yetzer Hara throws at us. So while the Yetzer Hara is asleep, which is the Beinoni's experience during prayer, it's a pleasure. It's wonderful. There's this complete focus, and there's this investment in the spiritual experience without the distraction, without the temptation. So because that's the Beinoni's experience during prayer, we now have to look at what happens when he closes the Siddur. And now we know from our own experience. We know that it is possible to go to shul and to feel incredibly inspired, either because of the prayers, or because of the songs, or because of something that the rabbi says, or because of the feeling of community. So we know what it's like to feel very, very inspired from the experience of being in prayer, being in shul, being with the community. And that's even greater on a day like Yom Kippur, where we're not just with the community, but everybody is in this heightened state of spirituality. But we also know that as inspiring and as connected and as powerful as any of those shul or davening experiences are, we all know what happens when you close the book, when you walk out of the door, and how easy it is to go from a person who was feeling so uplifted to a person who's back to their old self, speaking about this one, worrying about that eventuality, feeling the temptation of something we shouldn't do. It's the most normal thing in the world that when we are not directly plugged into a power source of spirituality, that we very, very quickly go back into a state of vulnerability. So how does it look for the Beinoni? The Beinoni closes the Siddur and effectively turns off that heightened state of spiritual awareness. What happens next? So that's what we're about to learn. If you are looking in the book, it's on page 48. And it is it's actually 6 lines from the bottom of the page because it's the last word on the line. If you're looking on the screen, it is the 3rd line, and again, the last word on the line. Aval achar hatfila. But after the prayers are over. And what happens after the prayers are over? So we said, while the Beinoni is in the state of prayer, they have this open, broad, developed intellectual perspective about Hashem, what we call moichin de gadlus, which is this very pristine, objective state of intellect where you can see things as they are, without all the bias and without being tainted by the realities of the world that we pay so much attention to. So that moichin de gadlus Ein Sof Baruch Hu, where the person is actually conscious of Hashem's infinite greatness, and that's what their meditation was all about, and that's what they were feeling uplifted by during their prayers, that turns off. As they close the Siddur, that turns off because they are now no longer plugged in. So the minute that inspiration or that power or that spiritual connection is terminated, the Yetzer Hara wakes up. It wakes up. Choser v'neir is actually a term, it's an halachic term, interestingly, and it's used to refer to something like a dormant impurity that could be reactivated due to whatever circumstances. So here you've got a dormant Yetzer Hara whose objective really is to try and confuse us and distract us and cause us to fail. But during the overwhelming spiritual state of prayer, it is dormant. Now that the prayers are over, it becomes active again. It's back in business. And where does it operate? As we learned in chapter 9, it operates in the so-called left side of the heart. And what that means in practical terms is it immediately starts to stimulate various desires for the things of the materialism of this world. So, theoretically, if we could engage with the Beinoni when the Beinoni was in the euphoric state of saying the Shema, there would be no possibility of any interest in this world. The Beinoni is not conscious of what kind of a chair they're sitting on, whether it is comfortable or it's uncomfortable. They're not paying attention to the time to see if they've run overtime and they really need to be somewhere else. They are totally invested in a spiritual experience without any sense of distraction. Now that Choizev and Neor, now that the Yetzer Hara has awoken, the Yetzer Hara says, let's talk about breakfast. Let's talk about getting your business off the ground. Let's talk about the fact that this shul really could have better acoustics, or whatever the things are that play on in a person's mind that relate to their personal needs and their personal desires. So that all wakes up. And the Yetzer Hara starts banging on the door again, saying, let's just have a good time. You've had your turn. You've invested. You've spiritually experienced. You've connected. You've had a meditative experience. You've transformed yourself. You've transcended your day-to-day experience. That was a rush. Now, let's go and balance. Because, it's very important to have a balanced lifestyle. And so we can't be completely caught up only in the world of spirituality. So let's get back to the normal world. Make sure that you have 2 sugars in your coffee. So at that moment that the prayers end, the Beinoni's chronic internal conflict resumes. And that's really what defines a Beinoni, a person who's living with chronic internal conflict. Now, when we learnt about a Rasha in chapter 11, it sounded like a Rasha also has a certain degree of chronic conflict. And the way we framed that is we called it this regret. Reshoim meleim charotos. That people who go against what Hashem wants consistently feel a sense of regret. I shouldn't have done that, and why did I allow myself, and how did I let my guard down, and that was a poor choice. That's not the conflict of the Beinoni. In other words, the conflict of the Rasha includes the possibility of failing and then trying to edge your way back into a position of health. The conflict of the Beinoni doesn't ever translate into failure, because if it were failure, it would be a Rasha. So that means the conflict of the Beinoni is an internal struggle, and it is a struggle, and it's an uphill battle that never crosses the threshold into inappropriate behavior. So while the Beinoni is davening, that chronic internal struggle is temporarily suspended. No sooner does the Beinoni complete the prayers, they're back into a state of struggle. Why? Because the Yetzer Hara is saying, let's get out there and enjoy the world. So now our key question is, if the Beinoni has that level of struggle, and if the Beinoni cannot be plugged in at all times to that elevated state of prayer, if that's true, then how does the Beinoni not succumb to the pressure? We all know what it's like. We know what it's like to be under incessant pressure. Any parent has had the experience where a child outnags you. And it's not because, in that case, it's not because the child is doing anything which is wrong or malicious. It's just because they continue and continue and continue asking and nagging until eventually it's just not worth our while. We don't have the energy to keep saying no, so we give in. The Yetzer Hara is more of a nag than any child you've ever met. The Yetzer Hara doesn't just come with a single angle to say, I want. It's a whole bouquet. You've got to do this, and you have to be conscious of that, and it's important to take care of your health, and this is a societal expectation, and you can't look like a schlump, and whatever the various things are that the Yetzer Hara throws at us, and it is incessant. It never stops. So how come the Beinoni does not succumb? We all succumb with all the best intentions. We promise ourselves things either on a daily basis or on an annual basis at Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. We promise ourselves certain things, and then we succumb. So what's the secret of the Beinoni? How does the Beinoni remain so focused and so resilient in the face of this constant hammering to say, let's do and try something else? So that's what we're going to call the afterglow of prayer. Because the Beinoni has such an intense experience of prayer, it empowers that Beinoni to survive during the day. It's very similar to our devices. You take your phone, you plug it into the charger. As long as it is plugged into the charger, it's strong or possibly even strengthening. Once you take it out of the charger, it's going to have less strength and it's going to continually lose strength, but it's still going to work. And that's kind of what happens to the Beinoni. So the Beinoni has this incredible, intense experience of prayer. Once the Beinoni unplugs from the prayer, it doesn't just dissolve. The effects of the prayer linger, and that assists the Beinoni to be protected from the shenanigans of the Yetzer Hara. So let's unpack and understand how that works. Why does the Yetzer Hara not get the upper hand? Why does the Beinoni not become a Rasha? Rak, because unlike in the case of the Rasha, the Beinoni's Yetzer Hara actually doesn't have authority in the small city. Remember in chapter 9, we spoke about the fact that the human being is a small city, and the two souls, the godly and the animal, are at war with each other for control of that city. And whoever gets to have control will determine how the person acts, how their body behaves, how their mind works, what they say, what they do. In the Beinoni's case, the Yetzer Hara never gets to control the city. In a Rasha's case, a lot of the time, the Yetzer Hara gets control of the city, or the animal soul gets control of the city. It's like an election cycle, So there's part of the time where the Nefesh HaBahamis party wins the election and actually has the authority to start making decisions and have influence on how a person behaves. In the Beinoni, it never reaches that point. So there's a constant campaign by the Nefesh HaBahamis, by the Yetzer Hara, the animalistic side of who we are, the impulsive side of who we are, is constantly trying to campaign to have a voice, to have control, but it never happens. And because it never happens, therefore it becomes impossible for the Yetzer Hara to translate its malevolent intentions into action. Whether it be b'maaseh, behavior, dibur, words, or machshava, mamish, or even thoughts. Now, we need to pause for a moment. Hang on a second, this doesn't seem to make sense. We're saying that as soon as the davening experience is over, the Beinoni feels desires for things which are inappropriate. And then we're saying that those desires never manifest, which means that he'll never act on those desires. He won't even discuss the desires or discuss the things he desires to converse about, and he won't even think about them. Well, that raises a massive question. If the Beinoni never thinks about these desires, how do you have desires without thinking about them? What other technology do we have for the experience of desiring something? Let's put this into simple terms. Let's say that a person walks into a room. Let's say they walk into a wedding and there's a beautiful buffet set up. Now, before the person gets to the wedding, they tell themselves, I'm on a diet, I'm going to be very disciplined, and I'm not going to have X. So I'm not going to have a second helping of the main course. I'm not going to have dessert. Then the dessert table is unveiled. And the person looks at it, wow, if I had known that, I wouldn't have made that decision that I'm not going to eat anything from dessert. So you know what? I think I should just have a little bit. That's desire, right? Desire to have some dessert. Where does that take place? In which part of the anatomy is a person experiencing desire? If not in one's thoughts. Where else could it be? It's a thought that a person has. Yes, it's a thought that is attached to a particular sensation, and that's really what we desire, is the sensation or the feedback that we're going to get from a particular thing. But it still happens in thought. So how then do we say that the Beinoni has a desire, due to the Yetzer Hara, for things which are not necessarily appropriate, and simultaneously say, but doesn't think about that desire? Well, if you don't think about it, how could you have the desire? So therefore he continues. What we mean is that the Beinoni never allows himself to invest in those thoughts, Eich lemalois, which would mean to start thinking, eich lemalos tavis liboy, how to fulfill the desire. This is an incredibly important insight into what makes a Beinoni unique. Let's look at that example. So here's a person, it's a terrible example for spiritual matters, but it's a great example for understanding how desires work. Person tells themselves objectively in the car the whole way to the wedding, they're telling themselves, I'm not going to have dessert, not going to have dessert, I'm going to be really good, I'm going to stick with the healthy stuff. Then they get to the wedding. It is almost a 100% guarantee that when they see the dessert, their thought process will change. Not only is it almost 100%, we could venture to say it is 100% that their thought process will change. Let's say that the person's favorite dessert is a particular kind of ice cream, and that's what they're serving at this particular event. As soon as the person sees that ice cream, there is no doubt that it will flash across their brain to say, oh, I would love to have some of that. That is a thought that cannot be controlled. We don't get to choose what pops into our heads. Sometimes we're actually quite taken aback by what pops into our heads, and we wonder, where did that come from? I didn't think I was that kind of person to think so negatively or to think so, to have such a terrible desire. Thoughts pop into our heads. However they get there, whether it's subliminal influences from the things that we see, whether it's something we've heard from somebody, whatever the cause is, thoughts come into our minds unintended. And the Beinoni shares that experience. The Beinoni has a Yetzer Hara / Nefesh HaBahamis animal soul that is always looking to feed those kinds of thoughts into the brain. Like the thought, I really wish I could have that dessert. Or like the thought, I have this incredible story to share and I'd love to share it. I know it's not appropriate because it's Lashon Hara, but I'd like to share it. Or the person, and this might sound a little far-fetched, the person who is Shabbos observant, and the thought crosses their mind to say, maybe today I'm just going to get in the car and go somewhere. Or the person who keeps kosher, who walks past a very fancy Michelin restaurant and thinks, you know what? I'd actually love to taste some of that. Those kinds of thoughts that pop into our heads do not determine our spiritual status. Even the Beinoni has that experience. The only people who don't have that experience are tzaddikim, because there is no source. There's nobody who could spring that thought on them, because the negative elements of their character, the Yetzer Hara, are eliminated from the picture. They're either locked away in the case of the imperfect tzaddik, or they have already come on board and are servicing our love and connection to Hashem in the case of a perfect tzaddik. But in the case of a Beinoni, who we're examining, these thoughts happen. As long as the Beinoni is not in the deep meditative state of prayer, these thoughts happen. So therefore, the test of whether the person is a Beinoni or not is not a test of whether they have inappropriate thoughts. Rather, it is a test on whether they entertain those thoughts or not. That's the key. The average person who has an inappropriate thought, the average person who observes the laws of kosher, walks past the Michelin restaurant, sees the particular dish that is the chef's special of the day, and thinks, I wish I could have that. And they probably stay with that thought for a while. For a while, they're thinking, can you imagine if there was a way that could actually be kosher? And then they start wondering, maybe when Mashiach comes, shellfish will be kosher. Or we'll be excused from the restrictions against dairy and meat. So there's this whole fantasy that starts to build in the person's mind. And where that fantasy becomes completely unhealthy and dangerous is if the person actually starts to think, how can I pull this off? So let's use the example of the person who's got something negative to say about somebody else, which they know they shouldn't, because they know it's Lashon Hara. The moment the person starts to think, maybe there's a way I can swing this. Maybe I could argue that it is what we call to'eles, which means where you're sharing information because it's for the public benefit, or for the rehabilitation of the person who's dealing with the crisis. So we try and construct in our minds a way to justify being able to do the thing which we're thinking of doing. That is a very toxic space to be. The Benoni never goes there. The Benoni has antivirus software that is so powerful that the minute an inappropriate thought is detected, whatever the defense system is that the Benoni has developed kicks into play, and that thought is truncated immediately. It's not given oxygen. That distinguishes the Benoni from us. Regular people, on occasion, and it's a matter of the spectrum of how frequently we allow those thoughts. And we even think maybe there's a way. That's like the person who's involved in some kind of a business, and they know that their business has to conform to halacha, and they're trying to find the workaround. Maybe if I sell a share of the business to somebody who's not Jewish, then it can operate on Shabbos. Of course, there are ways to do that. I'm talking about somebody who's trying to find a way that doesn't comply with halacha. Or the person who says, I know that we are required by Jewish law to pay tax to the country in which we live, but maybe there's a way that I could cheat on my taxes. So there are various things that pop into people's minds and sit there, sometimes for hours, sometimes for years. I wish there was a way. So the Benoni doesn't have this issue. The Benoni knows this is not an appropriate thought, therefore it stops immediately. That's a very high level of vigilance. When we talk about a struggle, in order to have the struggle and succeed in the struggle, you've got to really be on your game. When you talk about, for example, the infiltration of Israel's borders on October 7th, you realize how important it is to be vigilant. If a person wants to ensure that an environment is safe, then they have to be awake to a threat the minute the threat manifests. The Benoni ensures that their internal environment is safe because they're completely vigilant to any kind of an attack that comes from the Nefesh HaBahamis, that comes from the animal soul or the Yetzer Hara towards them, and they know how to shut it down immediately. Now, before we learn methodology, because that's a very big part of Tanya, is to teach the Benoni how to live as a Benoni, to teach us how to become a Benoni, to teach the Benoni how to maintain the status of Benoni and grow as a Benoni. Before we can get to any of that, the Alter Rebbe has to introduce us to an incredibly important principle. And it's a principle that informs pretty much everything that we're going to learn about personal development. Unfortunately, we live in a very strange period of history. One of the things that makes it so strange is that there's an overwhelming belief, certainly in Western societies, may not be in the entire world, but there's an overwhelming belief that there are chunks of people's experience that they have absolutely no control over. And because of that, the society has to prop them up and protect them and mollycoddle them, because you cannot expect people to change fundamental parts of their challenge. The principle that we're going to learn says that cannot be the case. Yes, it is possible for somebody to have a real pathology and they're unable to help themselves because it's a clinical condition. And then that has to be dealt with through a clinician. And if a person does have a clinical condition, the worst thing to do would be to say that society should accept them for who they are. That's not helpful. Society should help them manage their clinical condition. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about people who say, well, what do you want from me? This is who I am. You can't expect me to lose my identity or lose my mojo or lose my vibrance because of who I am and the fact that that does not align with greater values and a higher aspiration. So what the Alter Rebbe is going to teach us over here, which is fundamental to any meaningful personal growth, it should be patently obvious to everybody, apparently it isn't, is this principle. Ki hamoyach shalit al halev. Because the reality of a human is that the brain is the authority that rules over the heart. And he quotes the origin of this, it's from the Zohar. And then he says, Betul dasoi. That is the way we were born. That is how we are wired. This is core to our nature as humans. V'teva yetzirasoi. This is the nature of how we were formed. And in case we're not clear about this, he emphasizes, Shekach noitzar ha'adam betuldosoi. This is how humans were fashioned right from the start. This is critical information. The capacity for self-control is natural to humans. Anybody who argues that a person cannot control or modify their behavior, cannot mediate their behavior, is rejecting the nature of humans and what distinguishes humans from animals. Shekol Adam, every single human, Yochel is capable, using the willpower which is established through a person's intellectual focus, lehis apeik, to have self-control, velim shoel beruach ta'avosoi, and to rule over the spirit of desire that every human also has. Shebeliboy, the spirit of desire which is in a person's heart. Sheloi lemale mishaloi sliboy. Every person is capable of denying themselves the things that they believe they need because they desire. B'maise, dibur, umachshava. Whether that be something that should produce an action, or a way of speaking, or a thought process, the human being is absolutely and naturally wired to have self-restraint. I'm going to pause there. There's more to it. Let's just pause there for a moment and understand what's happening here. We know that everything is obviously by design, and if you believe that Hashem creates the world, which we do, then Hashem creates the world in a very precise fashion. And the way things appear is a reflection of the way things are designed internally. So, for example, there's an expression that King Solomon uses, Chacham einov beroishoi. A wise person, we're going to talk about this later in a few chapters' time, comes up again in Tanya. A wise person's eyes are in his head. So the Zohar asks the question, where else would you expect somebody's eyes to be? But the message is very strong. Vision, the ability to perceive, is by anatomical design in the head to show you that vision is key to understanding. If you really want to understand a concept properly, when you've seen something, it's much more real to you than if you've just heard about it. And therefore, when you truly understand something, it should be as realistic as if you had seen it with your own eyes. There are various other reasons as well why we speak about the eyes being in the head, including what we'll learn about later in Tanya. But that's just a little illustration. Everything is absolutely precise. The fact that Hashem designed our world in the way in which He did is to teach us all kinds of things about the spiritual nature of what lies beneath the surface, what the internal fabric and framework of existence is. So you now look at the things that exist in our world. There's a whole inanimate reality. Minerals and soil and rocks and water, and you look at them, their inability to move independently, their inability to grow, their inability to protect themselves, their inability to propagate are all indicators that the spiritual sub-fabric of this inanimate world is very limited. They've been endowed with a very limited degree of divine energy, and therefore, as a result, they have very limited capabilities. Whereas, by comparison, plants, which have the ability to grow, and they have the ability to propagate, and they have the ability to produce other things besides just the seeds of their own future. They can produce fruit, and they can even move, like the sunflower that tracks the sun, or the Venus flytrap that is even able to hunt in a certain sense. That tells us that what lies in the fabric beneath the epidermis of the plant is a more complex divine energy. And the fact that plants move in an upward direction, that's how they grow in an upward direction typically. So that illustrates that the energy which is associated with them is an energy of growth and development and improvement. So, for example, we could identify a plant element within the human being, and that is the striving to become better, to elevate ourselves, to grow. Animals are far more sophisticated than the plant kingdom, indicating that they must have a far more sophisticated spiritual injection. And that's why they're able to roam freely. They're not anchored to their life source like a plant is. And they're able to have certain levels of community and of intellect and of planning and of innovation. Of course, it's limited, but they're able to have it. If you had a look at the difference between the inanimate and the plant and the animal, you'd probably say that the inanimate and the plant, in certain respects, have certain things in common, their limitations. In other respects, the animal and the plant have things in common because they both have the ability to grow and to propagate. But one thing is for certain, when you introduce the human in as the next strata of life form, the human being is in a category of its own, because not only can a human being grow and propagate and roam and have a sense of community and a sense of intellect, humans are capable of inventing, they're capable of improving their life, they're capable of abstract experiences like humor or deep emotion, philosophy. So the human being is in a radically different category to the animal. Now you look at the anatomy of the average animal versus the anatomy of the average human, and that holds a massive clue as to what one of the most important distinctions is between our two sets of organisms. And that is that animals typically walk on all fours, whereas humans walk upright. Even those creatures that are essentially two-legged, whatever that means, because they'll always have a set of what you could call them forelegs, or you could call them arms, but they typically walk with a kind of at an angle, or they stand at an angle, which still orients them more towards the ground. Whereas humans stand upright, showing that we have an orientation towards things that are above us. In that anatomical structure, so we all have vital organs, and then we have a brain. In the animal's anatomy, the vital organs and the brain are typically on a single continuum. Whereas in the human, the vital organs and the brain are on a vertical axis, which means the brain will always sit at the highest point of the anatomy of a human being. That's completely different to an animal where it's not necessarily sitting at the highest point. So what's the significance of that? That reflects our nature. If Hashem designed us with the brain towering over the rest of the system, that doesn't only mean that the brain is responsible for the stimulation that runs the whole system, it means the brain is the controller of the system. In animals, and maybe even to a certain extent you might say in plants, but certainly in animals, the brain is the nerve center of the animal, so it's going to stimulate all the various things that the animal will do or how it will behave, etc. But there isn't the implication that the animal's brain is the controller of the system. It's the stimulator of the system. Now that might sound like semantics, but where you see the difference is that the animal brain doesn't really make a conscious decision ever to choose something that is in contrast to what the system wants. That means if there's a predator, let's say that there's a lion, and the predator sees its prey, so let's say a lion sees an impala. If that lion has eaten in the last few days, the impala is absolutely safe, because there's nothing in the system that requires it to hunt at this point. If, on the other hand, the lion is hungry, then it's going to stalk that impala. The entire system of the lion is set up to be an apex hunter that will chase down that prey in order to feed itself. And there's nothing in the lion's brain that can stop that. That's the thing. The lion's brain cannot say, you know what? I think I've noticed that in this particular area, the impala numbers have declined. And so maybe for the sustainability of the herd, we actually shouldn't hunt over here. So let's go somewhere else and we'll do some research and find another place where there's maybe an overpopulation and we'll rather hunt there. It's not possible. The brain of the animal is not designed to override the system. The system says hunt, then the brain's job is how best to get that prey. That's what distinguishes humans. Humans are by nature designed with a brain that is capable of overriding the system. That is our nature. That's what makes humans unique. So a human is somebody who could say, let's sort of match up the examples as closely as we can. The human is somebody who can say, that steak that is sitting on the plate, I don't think that it's a good idea for me to eat it because there's somebody else in the room and maybe it should be for them. Or maybe the person who's serving this meal is actually not as financially well off as they like us to think. So maybe they can't really afford to serve such a lavish supper. You know what? I'll hold back and I'll just have the vegetables. The system says, I want steak. I'm a human. I'm technically carnivorous. I'd like to have the steak. And I may even be hungry. So therefore, I'd like to have the steak because I want to eat. But the brain can override that system and say we're going to conduct ourselves and behave differently to what the system wants. Moyach shalit al alev betuldosei v'teva yetzirosei. The very nature of how we are designed is that the brain has the authority to be able to rule over, or maybe a better way to say it, to overrule the system, the desires, the impulse. The Beinoni is leveraging that. The Beinoni is living with that. The Beinoni is effectively saying, I don't care how often or how loud the Yetzer Hara screams that there is something worthwhile and it's interesting and it's going to make me feel good and it's everybody's doing it. I'm not going to make a decision based on what feels like it could be right or feels like it could be pleasurable. I'm going to make a decision based on what is objectively the correct way to behave. So if the objective reality is I shouldn't even have those thoughts, then the Beinoni shuts down the thoughts. And then he doesn't even have to get to the point of struggling whether or not to actually do this, because if you stop the thought process, it doesn't reach the point of translating into an action. So in summary, while the Beinoni is in a state of prayer, the Yetzer Hara is asleep, cannot get a word in edgeways, there's no possibility of distraction or temptation. When the Beinoni completes the prayers, then the Yetzer Hara kicks into gear and tries every trick that it possibly has to distract and tempt the Beinoni and get him into something which is an inappropriate kind of behavior. But it doesn't ever work because the Beinoni is acutely aware of this principle that the mind is in control, and therefore the first thing I need to do is use my mind, understand, is this kosher or not? If it's kosher, let's explore further. If it's not kosher, non-starter. Shut the system down. The antivirus locks you out. Now, there's still more for us to learn about this principle of Moyach Shalit al Halev, the principle of exactly how it works, that the mind should be able to control the heart. And it's a really, really important and fascinating discussion. It's valuable to all of us because even if we're not a Beinoni, we still have this capacity. It's B'teva Tuldasai. It's part of our nature. It's Tuldasai B'teva Yitzirasai. It's part of our nature, every single person's nature. And so therefore we should be conscious and using Moyach Shalit al Halev as much as we possibly can. But we'll talk about that more, please God, next time.